there is something to be said and something that we have to notice that John Conyers, this story sort of percolated and became a thing. Democrats forced him out. Al Franken, 7 women came forward and accused him of either sexual assault or sexual harassment. Democrats came forward and said he's got to go. And while it's admirable that Trent Franks left and Paul Ryan apparently had some say in that.
Well, Trent Franks, there is no hold, like the level of crazy that was.
No. It's totally insane. It's totally insane. But like, look, it's admirable that Paul Ryan did the right thing and said you got to leave. But to enable a guy like Blake Farenthold to still stick around is, I mean, the optics of that, as they say, are not very good.
There's also someone else in a high power Republican position who.
What's the name? How do you say that?
It's something.
Trump?
Trump, exactly.
Something like that.
Exactly. No, look, whether you agree or disagree with Frank and Conyers stepping down, and the reason I think they had to go, and I feel very strongly about this, had nothing to do with politics. It has to do with actual morality.
Yeah.
There has been a shift since they have gone in how this conversation has gone. There's been increased pressure on Trump. There's been more discussion, and there is actually a shift in the way people are looking at how the two parties deal with it, and it's an important one. I would love. I love scoring political points. I'd love more if the Republicans got their house in order and cleared out these monsters.
It's kind of disgusting because in that Paul Ryan resignation article yesterday from Politico, I'm sorry for cutting you off, by the way. I know it's not good in this setting, but Paul Ryan saying about Trent Franks having to go to Trent Franks and saying, you need to resign.
Yeah.
I didn't realize slitting throats was part of my job. That's a quote from Paul Ryan in this piece, basically saying that part of the reason he has to resign is because he has to tell these disgusting men that they have to step down.
Wow.
I honestly also and that's the part of the issue here too is, you know, to what extent is Paul Ryan going to set a zero tolerance policy, and what is the criteria going to be, the threshold going to be? And I think that with Democrats, they clearly decided that any form of harassment is grounds for resignation. Yep. People can agree or disagree with that because there are certainly many different types of cases that we are dealing with. But the fact that matters, we're in this watershed moment talking about sexual harassment, and Democrats certainly have always been very clear that we believe the women. And so that's actually where I think they want to make sure that they can reclaim that moral high ground. And you saw that with Conyers and Franken. Now with Republicans, they have struggled repeatedly with this very same question where not only have they already had a longstanding problem when it comes to women, but Trent Franks was forced out, but they've enabled Blake Farenthold to at least see out the rest of his term. And Roy Moore is someone that they were still supporting in many ways.
The RNC was giving money to him.
The RNC was giving money to him. Some of the people who had previously rescinded their endorsements were suddenly shifted to saying, including Mitch McConnell, well, it's up to the people of Alabama. They didn't criticize Trump for supporting him. And then, of course, they are often asked, well, what about Trump's accusers? And they just deflect and dodge.
I don't want to put you in a position where you have to sort of make a prediction.
I do.
But let me ask you this. Considering how much we have changed as a country in terms of having this conversation over the past, 3 months, but let's just say a year, would Donald Trump get elected today if he had this same scandal on his hands?
I think it's still possible.
I do too.
Because presidential elections...
More because of how he handled it.
Well, sure. I think that, but also presidential elections obviously there's so much more that is factoring into how people are voting. And I think party identification is still such the predominant motivator for people. And you look at the fact that 90% of Republicans went home to Trump at the end of the day. And in a special election in December in Alabama, there's someone who's an accused child molester. So somehow we're getting worse than, insofar as the types of assault, and you don't even want to have to parse them. But an accused child molester, I think that's something where you can see how, and also just smart campaign strategy on Doug Jones's part, you can see how he was able to pull off what is now deemed an upset. But I think in a presidential, and the way that Hillary Clinton was also portrayed and treated, and the kind of internal misogyny that a lot of people still live with, even women, I mean, you saw the white,
Hugely with
and
women,
also
yeah.
if actually the bigger point. Also, if you looked at the numbers in Alabama, you still had white women. The majority of white women
overwhelmingly
turn out for Roy Moore,
Yeah.
and that's exactly what happened with Trump.
Yeah.
So I think that in a race in an election that was primarily about race and nationalism, I still don't think that it would have been disqualifying.
So I don't think you're necessarily wrong, and you can't look at these things in a vacuum.
Yeah, sure.
There is no ability to say do it back in time, but one small thing's altered. But I do think there is a difference, and I think there has been an awakening, not just of stories and not just of women finally feeling that they have to come forward or they can come forward. I think there has also been a realization among men that the women that they need to listen a little bit more.
Yeah.
Some men that they need to listen and hear women more. And there is, you were absolutely right. I think it was like 92% of Republicans came home and voted for Trump, even though they didn't like him, and which is something that normally happens with elections. People go to their corners eventually. There is huge polarization in this country, but right now, Trump, and this is what I mean about a vacuum. Trump has created so much upheaval that he is disrupting the sort of tribal instincts of some people.
Right.
And I think the Me Too movement is part of that disruption too.
But I think so. Like, obviously, in the hypothetical, no one would have known what upheaval he would truly bring. That's why I think he still would have been elected, because we're also operating in a place where he's paved the way for potentially actually a little bit less tribalism, because he's created such disarray. But prior to him being elected, I think people will still be very much within their tribes. But I also think one thing that may have made a difference is the media, I think, would have covered it very differently, because you see what has happened in the way that these stories have been reported out. And there would have been a lot more attention given to Trump's accusers if this were happening in the midst of this movement, where every new accuser would have been a massive story. As opposed to, there were a few outlets who were interviewing a lot of these accusers, but they weren't being given a lot of time and attention, and they were being held up as equally egregious as controversies that Hillary Clinton was allegedly part of. I don't think that would have happened.
And as part of that, I think the news coverage has just gotten better. I don't think that it was handled very well during the election of how this went down. And even some people who reported on it had to come out and say, like,